today's topic, Understanding the Indic Perspective, and Professor Satish Deodar, who will be moderating the session. While we all would know Advocate Deepak and Professor Deodar, I'd like to take 2 minutes to introduce these eminent personalities before handing over the floor to them. J. Sai Deepak is an engineer turned law firm partner turned arguing counsel. Sai has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the Anna University and a bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur. Sai has been a litigator since July 2009 and is the founder of Law Chambers of J. Sai Deepak. Sai has been part of several landmark cases. Sai represented Greenpeace India against the Tata Sons, represented prominent Indian mobile brands against telecom patentees, and many others, wherein the code laid down law on the interplay between constitutional freedom and other rights. Sai has advocated for the right of members of Indian Armed Forces to supply of safe equipment as a part of right to life under the Constitution, argued on the arbitrability of IP disputes, represented ready-to-wait women campaigners in the Sabrimala Ayyappa temple petition, represented the chief tantri of the Sri Padmanabhan Swami temple, among others. Sai is a mentor to the legal team of the Indic Collective Trust, which is at the forefront of advocating Indic civil liberties through democratic and constitutional means. Sai is also an avid commentator, and his articles have been published in reputed international journals. He blogs on civil commercial litigation on the blog The Demanding Mistress and on constitutional law on Yukti, and frequently writes for the Daily Guardian, Open Magazine, the New Indian Express, and the Financial Express. We today have with us the Young Alumni Achievers Awardee from IIT Kharagpur, Advocate J. Sai Deepak. We are truly honored to have you with us, sir, today. The session will be moderated by Professor Satish Deodar. Professor Satish Deodar has done his master's and PhD in the field of economics from the Ohio State University and currently is a professor at IIM Ahmedabad, where he teaches subjects including micro and macroeconomics, economic environment and policy, economics of food quality, among others. He is the author of 6 books, including the non-fiction best-selling book, Day-to-Day Economics, and has more than 30 journal papers to his credit. He has twice been the recipient of the Devang Mehta Best Professor Economics Award and has also received the Distinguished Young Professor Award for Excellence in Research at IIM. We are happy to have you with us, sir, today and would now request you to start the session.
Okay, Shubham, you have been more than kind to me. I think you should speak more about the speaker, not me, just agitator to start the process, right? Yeah, so great. It's nice to have Sai here. I think I can go by first name, right? Sai. Yeah, and I think it's serendipity. I don't know why students contacted me that can I moderate this session. And when I looked at Sai's background, I said, I think I should come here because a few years ago, my colleagues and myself, we are going to Nashik. We are doing a program there for a company. And on our way, I said, we must go to Trambakeshwar. The Trambakeshwar is on its way. And since I was born in Nashik, had been to Trambakeshwar as a child. And I thought, this is second time, I was excited to go. And we went there, of course. But the moment you go there, you figure out, that place is not that clean or, it's not all managed that way. Then somebody had mentioned to me that, no, it's government-run trusts, So, issue was there at the back of my mind that why is that these temples are government-run? And then when I saw Sai's background, he has worked on these issues, I said, I must come. I certainly, so I was happy to, moderate this event. But as a moderator, I think I just ask one question to Sai and then he can take the lead. And then, of course, Chirag and Dhruv, others can, manage the question that students may have. So Sai, maybe if you can give us a broad understanding of what you mean by the Indic civilizational perspective on looking at different socio-economic ways of life in India. If you give a broad framework first, and then you can talk about some of the cases that you have been related to, and then of course followed by the question answers. So I think floor or the Zoom is yours. You need to unmute him, man.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So first of all, I'd like to thank the students of the Public Policy Club of IIM Ahmedabad for giving me an opportunity to interact with some of the brightest minds of the country, and Professor Theothar as well for agreeing to moderate this session. It's a privilege to be and to share space with all of you. See, the thing is, as far as the Indic perspective is concerned, I need to make a few caveats or disclaimers in the first place. One, I am not even remotely the pioneer of this particular position. I don't think I am the first one to actually take this particular position or to present it before, let's say, the public, so to speak, or even before a certain cross-section of the audience. What I have done over the last 2 to 3 years is to try and capture this particular position in a language that this particular generation, perhaps my contemporaries, can understand. And I have openly and as candidly as possible built on the literature that has been created over the last at least 150 to 200 years, both in English and in other languages. And ultimately, what is this particular perspective all about? Let me try and give perhaps a very contemporary peg to this. I'm sure a lot of people have read Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, his article in 1992, as well as the book that was subsequently published in 96. Now, the one thing that he posits, which I agree with as a position, and not that I agree with every aspect of his book and all the challenges and all the issues that he highlights, that perhaps we live in the age of civilizations. And this is something that has, this particular resurgence of the civilizational identity is something that has been around not just for the last 15, 20 years, or after Cold War, as Samuel Huntington actually posits. I believe that the movement towards a civilizational identity perhaps started even before, or let's say in the early 1900s, perhaps before the First World War or immediately after that. Global civilization, so to speak, or humankind has started moving towards pivoting its identity around the concept of civilization. And much before the concept of an Indic identity or so on and so forth came about, the question of Indian identity itself, when it was discussed as the topic of, let's say, contention, when we started making a case for Indian independence, the Britishers started asking us, how do you think you can hope to survive as an independent political unit when you have never been a single political unit ever in your history? Was their basic position and their reading of our history. And around that time, if you see the positions taken by multiple people, from Mahadev Govind Ranade to Mr. Gandhi, Sri Rabindranath Tagore, and a lot of other people, they started making a case for Indian nationhood, not on the basis of the concept of a nation state, but on the basis of a civilizational identity of this subcontinent, to basically say, please don't judge us on the yardsticks of European definitions of nationhood or a nation state, because we do not conform to those definitions. And we have a very different history. Our way of life is very different. Our approach to divinity is very different. Our approach to what constitutes a custom, tradition, community, everything is very different. You may be very comfortable using either religion or language as the basis for understanding what constitutes a nation state. But given that we have been around for at least 5,000 to 6,000 years, I don't agree with a lot of views and his representation of this particular phase of Indian history. I do believe that it's a book worth reading because it at least captures the chronology of the development of this particular idea. And the title of this book is Talking Back, the Idea of Civilization in Indian Nationalist Discourse, written by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. And he's written quite a few books around this particular topic. At the very least, this book serves as a fantastic compilation of various voices, various ideas. Whether or not you ultimately agree with the conclusion of the book and the inferences of this book, I would certainly recommend reading this particular book. And therefore, according to me, what is it that the Indic perspective stands for? So I've explained what its origins are and what its triggers are and how it distinguishes itself from the European perspective of nationhood. What is it that it actually translates to? One, it effectively translates to a framework for reclamation of an identity, of the indigenous identity of the land. Now, there's a decent chance that this could come across as an illiberal idea or an ethno-nationalistic idea if it is not understood properly. The reason why Indian civilizational position cannot be conflated with ethno-nationalism of the European kind, or of, let's say, of the kind that the Second World War effectively witnessed, is because by default, our civilizational identity encompasses multiple sub-identities as part of its canvas, as part of its panoramic canvas. And therefore, there is no question of using mere ethnicity as the prism to understand the Indian civilization. It goes much beyond ethnicity. Because as a consequence of its longevity of journey, it has actually, I would say, assimilated multiple cultures. Whether it has assimilated multiple ethnicities or not is a matter of science, which I'm not to comment on. Perhaps that is something that ethnographers and people who speak of genetics have to comment on, and on race studies. I'm not in a position to comment on that. All I'm in a position to clearly comment on the fact is that we have had a sense of civilization, notwithstanding the fact that we may not have been a single political unit. Now, the one thing that, of course, we can draw parallels with respect to European history is that a sense of identity is always a precursor to the formation of nationhood. So the Germanic identity was certainly present before the unification of Germany in 1871. So if someone says that you can't have the concept of an identity until there's a concept of a nationhood, I think it translates to putting the cart before the horse. The first thing that ultimately takes birth is the idea, and then the concretization or the crystallization of the society around that particular idea, where it starts fashioning the society around that particular idea using the idea as the okay. Therefore, the Indic perspective is to basically say whether or not we are the best civilization in the world or we are the most advanced civilization in the world is not the question. The question is, we do have a past, and we have the right to understand our past in our own terms, according to our own language, according to our own epistemology. And our worth or lack of it thereof is not to be judged on the parameters of an alien standard, and certainly not a Eurocentric standard or a Western-centric standard. And is India, let's say, the only society or the only country to make this case? No. Every post-colonial society has sought to reclaim its identity and has sought to reinvent its past and reconstruct its past, and not by entirely demolishing the concept of modernity or demolishing the concept of contemporariness, but to basically see how is it that it can continue to, let's say, live by its own way of life, and apply it to the circumstances in which it lives, okay, to try and make it as relevant as possible. You can take the example of Israel, you can take an example of any number of countries which have previously been under colonizing powers. So around this particular concept also started another framework, and which is something that I've been writing as much as possible to the best of my limited abilities, is the concept of decoloniality, which is to basically say, see, we have heard of the word colonization, we have heard of the word decolonization. Then what is it that distinguishes colonization, decolonization from coloniality and decoloniality? Colonization is a physical form of oppression and occupation where you're actually ruled by a colonizing power. Whereas coloniality would effectively translate to you accepting in your headspace the worldview of the colonizing power, and effectively replacing your indigenous filter and your indigenous worldview with the worldview and the filter of the colonizer. Which means even after the white man has left this country or the colonizer has left this country, if you continue to see yourself as the intellectual successors of the traditions and the institutions and the values of the colonizer, for all practical purposes, you continue to further coloniality, which is to say that the influence of the way of life and the influence of the colonizing powers impression of you continues even after he has vacated the place. So this pejorative term that is constantly used, which is Brown Sahib, is practically, I would say, a codified representation of coloniality, where you still look at yourself as to whether or not you're educated based on your ability to speak in English, based on your ability to understand English concepts of fair play, justice, rule of law, and whatnot, as opposed to asking, what are my indigenous concepts of justice? What are my independent concepts of political organization? What are my independent concepts of, let's say, social organization? What, according to me, is justice, gender justice, equality, social justice, so on and so forth. So, Indic perspective is both descriptive and prescriptive, which is to say, it describes a certain angst in the native to try and reclaim his past, and to try and ask whether his past is so useless that it is not even worth looking at and learning from. And it is prescriptive to the extent of saying that today global history is perhaps at a crossroads where the Western civilization's hold is on the decline. On that, I completely agree with Huntington's prognosis, and a lot of people have said that even before. Therefore, if the Western society and its values are on the decline, what is it that India has to offer to the global pool of thought, and where is it going to draw from as a repository to contribute to the global pool of thought? Now, assume for a moment that you completely remove the English concepts, the Anglo-Saxon model, the Anglo-Saxon way of constructing your society, of urbanization, of policy making and everything. Is India so poor a country intellectually where it doesn't have anything to draw from its past? My answer would be no. After all, these people came running to this particular country because this country was a load magnet thanks to its knowledge, thanks to its industry, thanks to what it was capable of producing, and not just natural resources. So if it is an established fact today that the Industrial Revolution, at least in Britain, was funded by the depredation of Indian resources, by the depredation of Indian manpower and so, or human resource, so to speak, that means there was something of value that we had to offer. And is there something that we can learn from those aspects of the past without necessarily glorifying it till the cows come home, unintended? The question is to basically ask, what is it that we can adopt from the past, make it contemporarily relevant, and present as our original thought when we aspire to be a global superpower or a regional superpower or a soft power, whatever you may wish to call. Why should you be taken seriously if all you're presenting to the world is your repackaged narrative of the colonizer's narrative as opposed to your own original thought? The world might as well benefit from the original as opposed to wannabe fake. Okay, that's the basic position. Okay, so the Indic perspective is both, as I said, descriptive and prescriptive. It is not necessarily based on an archival study of the past, because you see, India, for all practical purposes, is a living civilization where several parts of this country, several aspects of this country continue to represent an unbroken tradition of, at the very least, 2,000 to 3,000 years, even if not more. Okay. Very few civilizations can actually lay claim to this kind of a continuum. Perhaps the Far East can, Japan to some extent. But in most of the societies, the concept of a living civilization with an unbroken tradition, where the language, the ritual, the rites, the traditions, which your ancestor would have performed and observed at least 3,000 years ago, you continue to do so, whether it comes to marriage, whether it comes to death, whether it comes to birth, whether it comes to societal relationships. So you're not trying to revive a dead system. You're not trying to revive a dead civilization. You're saying you're a living civilization which does not have a clear historical knowledge of its past. That is the difference. So to revive its sense of history and to place before the rest of the world, more than the rest of the world, you have to convince yourself first. What is the point of trying to sell a product to the rest of the world unless and until you believe in the product yourself? And what is it that you believe in that product? Are you trying to create a myth? Are you trying to create a legend? Or do you have concrete facts? If you talk about concrete facts, what is your definition of fact? What is your definition of authority? What is your definition of historical evidence? Because the concept of evidence is largely documentary when you look at the Western concept, for the simple reason that they are people of the book. The Judeo-Abrahamic tradition has significantly influenced their principles of evidence as well. Whereas Bharat and the Indian subcontinent is largely has a tradition of oral traditions and oral evidence. So today, if I were to say that even in the absence of a certain document which proves the presence of a certain practice, my ancestors have passed on this particular tradition for close to 7 to 8 generations through oral tradition. Why should my position suffer from lack of evidentiary standards merely because you're not willing to recognize this form of evidence, because you're not conditioned to look at this particular form of evidence? That's not my problem. It doesn't render my position any less valid or authentic. This, in sum and substance, is the, let's call it the broad metes and bounds, the contours of the Indic perspective.
Okay. Yeah, so could you give us a few of the examples that you are, actively involved with and relate to this concept now?
So there's a decent chance that I may have to resort to a bit of Atmastuti here. So pardon me for actually sharing some of my experiences, because whether we like it or not, some of my decisions and the positions that I've taken on national issues or issues of national interest is to a significant extent a product of my own personal experience and decisions that I have taken. there has been a symbiotic relationship between the two. So my decision to make a switch from engineering to law itself was triggered largely by the sheer exasperation of, let's say, the cancel culture having started in 2004, 2005 itself, wherein if you hold a certain position on any issue of national interest, which doesn't meet with the acceptance of the established ecosystem, then you're effectively cancelled, you're ostracized, you're isolated, you're stifled, silenced, and suffocated. That is effectively what happens. So the idea was to start talking back. But you see, you can't hope to talk back on issues such as history or law by simple self-reading. It doesn't work that way. You need to equip yourself with a fair amount of formal training. After all, if you respect someone who has a formal training, why would you say that I don't need formal training to speak on a certain subject? You must respect somebody's expertise as well, and the fact that somebody has put in an effort to acquire the requisite skills for it. I'm not saying that the existence of formal training is proof of the fact that somebody is an expert. I'm not making that statement. People can still be idiots, notwithstanding the fact that they have formal training. I'm not making that position. I'm simply saying if you're serious about something, you must focus on trying to garner formal skills in that particular field. So I made the transition to law. And when I made the particular transition, the first idea was not to start forming opinions like an activist or form opinions like like a political thinker. The idea was to first understand the subject in its own terms and acquire a certain degree of proficiency as a litigator. So for the first 7 years was effectively spent in cementing my position as a commercial litigator. I rose to become an associate partner at a leading law firm. And then when I quit, by which time I'd already acquired a reputation as an arguing counsel who could argue on multiple subjects. Now I could afford to take individual positions on issues which could be provocative in nature. If I associate myself with another entity and I continue to hold certain positions which may attract controversy or debate, then not only do I affect my reputation, I also affect the reputation of the outfit that I'm associated with. So I did not want any outfit to bear the responsibility or the consequence for my positions. So going independent as an arguing counsel gave me the freedom, the autonomy. I would say I still had the autonomy before, but my own sense of responsibility prevented me from airing some of those views. So when I went independent in 2016, I decided to flex my muscle, having established myself as a fairly decent litigator of a certain proficiency and standing in certain areas of practice. So around that period is when the Sabarimala matter effectively landed on my table, and I was asked to represent some of these organizations, and I took up each of these causes pro bono. So while today someone who practices an arguing counsel and who aspires to be a senior advocate needs to show a certain degree of pro bono commitments, I started taking up pro bono commitments in 2016 itself, and about 15 to 20% of my time is spent on those pro bono commitments. So I decided to commit my pro bono time to the causes of Indic issues. So that's effectively how it started. Let me be also candid on this particular front that my own knowledge of dharma or of civilization was abysmal and negligible, notwithstanding the fact that I'd made the transition to law until 2015-16. It is around that period that I was exposed to a lot of these temple-related litigations, where senior advocates of standing in the Supreme Court had, they were interested in getting me on board for those matters because they felt that I could add value and contribute to those matters. So when I started getting exposed to those matters, that is when I slowly understood how state control of Hindu religious institutions effectively has a very skewed and a distorted outcome, so to speak. But the idea was not to limit myself only to a legal analysis with blinkers. The idea was to understand, if I really have to make a case for temple freedom, then I need to first of all understand the role, the function, and let's say the nature of the duty performed by this institution called the temple in the society. So that led me to read a lot more about the role of these centers of identity in civilization terms, in economic terms, and so on and so forth. And that gradually pulled me further and further into understanding more about civilization in the language that the civilization is meant to be understood, which is not English. As much as possible, you try and relate to these sources firsthand in the language that they have been authored, or at the very least, in native languages, which are the closest translations possible to an Indian language. So I started doing that. So the Sabarimala matter, then the matter, then multiple petitions which are pending before the Supreme Court and various high courts asking for the government, so to speak, to vacate the temple and to release the temple from their control. Then the Sri Padmanabha Swami matter. Then we also participated in the Rohingya immigration matter, or illegal immigration matter. Then I was briefly associated with a huge team that was working on the Ram Janmabhoomi case. In fact, I participated in contributing to arguments to a very limited extent until the matter was before the three-judge bench and before it was referred to the Constitution bench finally in the High Court itself. And several senior counsels were kind enough to allow me to assist them and give them the arguments and whatever that I felt was useful. So each of these experiences has given me, to some extent, some amount of practical knowledge, on-ground knowledge as to how it works on the ground and how it plays itself out in the court as well, to be able to say, perhaps we need to start recalibrating our compass, our civilizational compass and our policy-making compass. And I'm introducing this specifically because the organizers come from the public policy background. I do believe that decoloniality and the Indic perspective are going to play a central role in two very specific areas: policy making, judicial pronouncements, and the manner in which the Constitution is going to be treated. So that's been my experience so far. And the Sabarimala case effectively exposed me to the sheer diversity of the civilization and busted this nonsense that Hinduism is a monolith in my head completely. That what we understand as Hinduism is an agglomeration of multiple dharmic sampradayas or dharmic identities, each of which has its own unique tradition and which it is extremely proud of. Okay. And the stakeholders first believe in that localized identity and in that localized tradition first before relating to the larger whole. So I got a fair bit of exposure to this. I have been introduced to people who are qualified in the Dharma Shastras, who understand the subject so well and who are in a position to explain it to someone like me who has zero training in the Dharma Shastras. And I've been exposed to people who are trying to be bridge scholars between the Anglo-Saxon model as well as the Shastric model, so to speak, so that they can cross-pollinate between one and the other. This has been the sum and substance of my experience. And I've also managed to make sure that I share my views with people who are my contemporaries and others as well, and subject my views to a lot of scrutiny. I'm not scared of scrutiny, nor does a question scare me necessarily. If I have an answer, I will spell it out. If I don't have an answer, I'm happy to admit my ignorance. But at the very least, I know for a fact that I'm not bound to make a statement for which I don't have support. So largely speaking, I think I'm very, very happy that now there is an audience for this particular position. And therefore, there is a fantastic audience that can be introduced to the literature of stalwarts. All I'm doing is to try and tell them, please read this, because you're bound to be better informed once you read this. And there's a decent chance that all the cobwebs in your head about what this civilization is about, whether it is all about only caste and sati, and is there much more to this particular civilization than what has been taught in textbook and schools, that is something that I think that movement has already started. And the good part is I was slightly skeptical of whether this particular generation, which is so in awe of technology, is bound to respect the past of this particular land and civilization. Frankly speaking, my skepticism was misplaced. While there is always a chance that 30 to 40% of the audience may not agree with my views, I found a significant cross-section of people who are willing to understand, who are willing to learn and engage. So that, I think, has been a great learning experience and has helped me give a lot of confidence.
Yeah, try to be a little more specific so that you can, broaden your discussion. For me, most of our students, or even myself, when we hear that Ram Lala was represented in Supreme Court, or Padmanabha Swami was represented in Supreme Court, or Sabarimala, the deity. So is this the Indic context that deity can be represented in a court of law? And would that have happened in a foreign country as well? Or they could represent us, if there are no deities, I get God or whatever, that concept, if you can just explain it to us.
Okay, so a simple question. Where does the company exist according to you? Does it exist in reality or in somebody's mind?
I'll let my students answer.
So company is, for all practical purposes, the product of legal fiction, where you decide to create a juristic character and you say it exists. But ultimately, the company is run by human agents, which is why you have the doctrine of lifting of the veil and so on and so forth when it comes to company law, right? So when we accept the existence of a certain fictional entity for the purposes of transactional convenience, and that company is capable of being sued and suing third parties and ownership of ownership of property. And a company also has access to certain fundamental rights, okay? Because a company may not be a citizen, but a company is a person for the purposes of the Constitution, because person is both natural and juristic. Then the simple question would be, what is so great about a company that entitles it to certain rights under the law, which a deity cannot? Because a deity at the end of the day is equally, I'm not going to call the deity a creation of the mind, because the relationship between the deity and the devout is actually slightly different. At least in Hindu conception of, let's say, what is a god, we don't believe in the concept of God strictly, we believe in the concept of deities. We believe in the concept of supreme consciousness and its manifestations in the form of deities. If such is the situation, in your worldview, for the purposes of your way of life and for the purposes of that specific institution, there exists a living person called deity. Okay? So therefore, the concept of a deity is something which is not at all difficult to wrap your head around, for the simple reason that the law has enough tools to recognize. And the important point is, the concept of deity has been recognized in Indian law, not just under the, let's say, the Indian judicial establishment after independence. It was recognized even by the Britisher way before in all Privy Council judgments and a lot of judgments, as part of dealing with temple-related matters on what is a charitable endowment, what is a religious endowment, how do we resolve dispute into charitable endowments. Okay, so assume for a moment that I have to answer this question from the standpoint of an atheist or someone who doesn't believe in the concept of a deity. Reduce the deity to the simple status of a sacred purpose or a pious purpose, which is to say, I have identified a specific object of worship, and I have decided to dedicate my resources or endow my resources to that particular object of worship. And I believe that revenue or proceeds earned from that particular property must benefit that particular object of worship. Okay. Now, apply simple rules of property rights. What I do with my property is honestly nobody's business, right? Except for the fact that I have to operate within the bounds of the law. So I have the right to dedicate my property as much to an animate person to an inanimate person. There's no distinction. Nobody can stop me from alienating my property in the name of an object of worship. So when I choose to do that, there are two aspects which are protected. While my interest is in protecting the rights of that particular object of worship, I'm equally interested in protecting the rights of those who believe in that object of worship. Because there is a symbiotic relationship. The deity does not exist unless and until, the deity exists of course, but the deity's position and its relevance becomes manifest only when there is someone who believes in that particular deity. Okay? Unless and until there is another end of this particular terminal, this transaction is not complete, so to speak. Okay? So therefore, the concept of deity rights, the personification of the deity, the juristic character of deity, each of these aspects have received judicial recognition even before independence, applying the traditional principles of Anglo-Saxon law, because you see, Anglo-Saxon law does one thing very, very clearly. Wherever the colonizer went, he would try and apply his principles, but tailor them in accordance with local practices. Okay? This translates to what is known as autochthonous application or custom-made, or let's say customary application or tailor-made application of a principle. So when the British man goes to Ireland, conquers Ireland, separates it on the basis of Catholics and Protestants, and then chooses to establish his legal system, because you see, the most tangible direct form of colonization is establishment of the legal system, because then every transaction, the concept of law is decided by that particular person's yardsticks. So they decided to recognize that Irish practices and Irish philosophies and belief systems have equal validity, but they would somehow try and find justification for Irish practice under English law. Similarly, justifications for Hindu practices and justifications for Muslim practices were effectively carved out as part of application of English law. Okay. Now that was the white man's problem, because ultimately he continued to, or he wanted to perpetuate his legal system. But after his departure, why am I still bound by his problems of applying English law to Indian practices? I don't need to. My therefore simple position is, now when I talk of Hindu law, when I speak of Hindu practices, at least in relation to Hindu institutions, which have a very clear religious character, I must not be fettered by English principles. I must apply the law that applies to that particular place and the belief systems that apply to that particular place. And it is not as if we are bereft of that particular guidance. Okay. So in Sabarimala case, what effectively happened was, I merely extrapolated the existing position to say, if it is your case that a deity exists for the purposes of other legal rights, such as ownership of property and whatnot, I fail to understand why can't the deity also enjoy rights under the constitution? Okay. Because the constitution is the one that recognizes rights to property and fetters on rights to property. And if you believe that one particular form of property or one particular form of right which the constitution recognizes can be enjoyed by this particular artificial character or juristic character or living person, whichever way you choose to believe it, what is your logic to say that other forms are not available and other rights are not available to this particular entity? Why? Let's look at it this way. If you belong to a certain religion or a certain way of life, you trace your origins to that particular deity and the notion of that particular deity. Your rights and your right to actually believe in that particular way comes from a certain source. If the source itself has no rights and no recognition under the law, what is my standing? My standing is independent. It can't be independent of that. So if the object of my worship, the institution that is dedicated to that object of worship, the traditions and practices that are associated with that particular object of worship have no legal validity, have no legal recognition, have no fundamental rights, have no constitutional protection, where do I stand? To put it in the language of Hindu Itihasas and Puranas, I would have a Trishanku status, na ghar ka na ghat ka. Okay, so it really makes no sense to say that let's artificially separate the active ingredient from the tree and recognize that the active ingredient has certain characteristics, but the tree itself doesn't have those characteristics. The active ingredient has those characteristics precisely because it comes from a certain tree. And you can't say that the tree lacks those characteristics and those rights. Okay. So what we presented was not new. It was effectively an extrapolation of a pre-existing position, but we said in this context, it makes perfect sense to effectively argue that if you deny my right to preserve the sanctity of this particular place in the manner in which it is required, you're denying the deity's right to decide how his house must be run or how her house must be run, because a temple is not a place of, let's say, prayer, it's a place of worship. There is a difference between prayer and worship. And therefore, do not apply Hindu yardsticks to an Islamic place of worship or an Abrahamic yardstick to a Hindu place of worship. Treat them in accordance with their own belief systems, treat them in accordance with their own theology and ecclesiastical practices. That was the basic submission. Okay. It makes very little sense to try and apply the concept of sampradaya to a Muslim concept of denomination or a Christian concept of denomination. Okay. Similarly, you can't apply those definitions to my practice because we obviously come from a very different perspective, a very different background. To each his own is the sum and substance of this position.
Okay, let me just ask one extended question, then I'll stop. I should not monopolize. There are many other questions, actually many more questions, but just an extended one, then I'll stop. Then Dhruva and you guys, Chirag, can let others speak.
Yes.
One extended question. So is this context, is this the reason why, if my understanding is correct, that the Hindu temples are in government trusts and in other denominations, other faiths, there is no concept of deity, and therefore those are not manned by the government, or what is the relation? Why one is this way, the other one is that way?
Actually, there is no relationship between the basic conception of a deity or, let's say, a living person between in terms of government control. Because you see, a government, when it undertakes a certain activity, since it's not a monarchy or a theocracy or a theological state, so to speak, it has to necessarily trace its powers to some document. किसी न किसी काले अक्षर को trace करना पड़ेगा कि this is where your power comes from. This is the source of your power. Otherwise, the first question that is asked in a writ petition is quo warranto. What is your power to do something? Okay. So therefore, there must be some provision of the constitution under which governments effectively legislate with respect to places of worship. So there is a very specific provision, Article 25(2)(a). And that particular power, which is given to the state, is meant to be applied across the board without exception to any particular religion or religious community or practice or denomination. But what has happened over the course of the last 60, 70 years or even before is that for all practical purposes, the government has chosen to exercise its power of regulation, restriction, and control exclusively with the institutions of one particular community. Again, I've said this even before, that if you choose to exercise your rights with respect to exclusively with one community, there are only two outcomes. One, you believe that that is the only community that requires the government's intervention, or you believe that the government is closest to that particular community, therefore there is a greater degree of familiarity between the government and that community. If that is the case, you might as well declare India a Hindu state. That's up to you. Is that what you wish to do? If you constantly choose to interfere with Hindu religious institutions because you believe that the government enjoys a greater proximity with the Hindu society, then what is the message that you're actually sending to the rest of the world as well as to the rest of the country on the question of secularism? That is for you to answer. That is not for me to answer. As this government, you have to answer this particular question. Two, again, I'll use company law. Either under the IBC or under traditional company law, assume for a moment that there is a question of oppression and mismanagement, or there is a question of financial bungling or whatever it may be. The government at best has interventionary powers to restructure the management of that particular company, set its record straight, and get out of the place, right? Which means a private property can be interfered with for a very limited purpose to address a certain issue. And once that issue is addressed, control over that particular private property, even if it's a public listed company, reverts in the hands of a non-state entity, which was originally the owner or the stakeholder. The logic with respect to even a temple for that matter, or even more with respect to a temple is, one, it's a religious place. Two, you claim to be a secular state. You have multiple express constitutional fetters in terms of your relationship and let's say how proximate you can be to a religious institution. Assuming that mismanagement and financial bungling or malfeasance is your reason for entering a certain religious institution, your limited job is to address that, put in place a certain process, put in place a certain mechanism, and vacate the place with respect before you're held by the scruff of your collars and asked to get out. Okay. Now, when the government, as opposed to doing that, continues to entrench itself in that particular institution, doesn't vacate at all, and continues to say, because you have not managed it properly, I will continue to sit there for 70 years, then you have actually proved my case that you have not been able to rectify that mismanagement for 70 years. So who is the worser manager? You. And you are the state. You're the secular institution. I'm better off managed in the same fashion by the community than by the state. At least I will have my autonomy. I will be in a position to take action against those people who are encroaching upon the temple's property, or who are effectively freeloading from the temple's resources, or with respect to the maintenance of traditions. Why do I need to suffer a license permit Raj, at least as far as temples are concerned, where I'm expected to present an annual budget before the Babu, and until the Babu gives a sign off, I can't spend a farthing or a shilling with respect to my activities. If the liberalization of the secular economy is something that we are so happy about and we celebrate, when will we actually have the liberalization of the religious economy and religious institutions? That is something that this country is yet to see. A significant number of those institutions in the better part of the country, at least over 15 states, there are legislations which control temples in one way or the other. Which canon, which principle, which, let's say, established yardstick of secularism permits this? This is some weird khichdi that India has invented. Only India can invent this kind of stuff. Nobody else can do this. So my point is, we are neither honest about our civilizational identity, nor are we subscribing to a notion of secularism. It is neither a constitutional position nor a clear religious position. This seems to be a politically convenient and expedient position. Okay. And no particular dispensation or no particular party is an exception to this particular rule. Across the board, everybody has done this. For everyone, mandir's coffers have been mandir ki ghanti. Anybody has come and effectively decided to put their hands into the temple's coffers, take money from it and use it for secular purposes. Since when did you have the right as a secular state to dip your hands into religious institutions' resources and use it for secular purposes without the concept of autonomy of the community or the stakeholders? Where is the concept of private right? Where is the concept of property right or consent in this entire process? That's the basic question. And people assume largely that this is an issue that is limited only to the southern part of the country. They should only do a bit more of reading and they'll realize that in Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, West Bengal, Delhi, in Uttar Pradesh, you'll have a lot of these legislations which have been tailor-made to address these institutions. To the extent that I think in Uttar Pradesh, a central legislation which has been amended for state application has a charity commissioner who has complete and exclusive control with respect to how the money and the coffers of temples shall be spent and for what purposes. There is absolutely no say of the community or the stakeholders from the community at all. This is the extent to which we have actually arrogated and appropriated the resources of only one community. Christians and Christian institutions have no law, by the way. The Shiromani Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee is effectively an institution established under the Gurudwara Act of 1920 and it is autonomous. The Waqf Board doesn't suffer this kind of state intervention. So I have to ask, humne kya paap kiya bhai, ye to bata do. That's the basic thing that you have to answer. I don't think the state has any answer except for saying, if I am not there, what will happen to you? Great. The British had also asked Indians, if we are not there, who will rule you? So how are you any different from the British? You're giving the same reasons. You're giving the same excuses. You're telling me that we are not capable of running our own institutions, but we are capable of occupying our positions in bureaucracy. We are capable of running independent institutions which generate wealth in this particular country, but somehow we can't manage our own religious institutions. That seems like a mighty convenient argument to me.
So is that so because the Hindu temples are run by the state? Are they therefore emphasizing on equality between men and women? What happened in Sabrimala? Because in some other faiths, I know, I mean, I may be wrong, but this is my perception that women cannot become priests or women cannot go to a place of worship. That happens in some other community, other faiths. But here, because it's state-run, therefore men and equal are equal, and therefore in Sabrimala women must go. Is that the logic that was there in that case?
So I have two levels of answers to this. So one, this issue can be addressed without reference to any other religion. Okay. What somebody does as part of their religion is their headache. It is for them to decide how they wish to live. Okay. Do they want to move forward, or do they believe that they are perfectly happy where they are, is a decision that for that community to make. The mistake that we make is to constantly apply our yardsticks to their ways of life. Similarly, we don't want their yardsticks to be applied to us. So assume for a moment that in a particular community or in a particular faith system, the woman is being treated as being inferior to man. That is for them to decide, and hopefully there will be a churn from within the community that will lead to a difference of opinion at a later point in time. I'm not concerned about that. But the only thing that I'm certainly concerned about is, as a state, since you're expected to be, let's say, equidistant from all faiths for all practical purposes, your presence in a certain institution seems to have a certain outcome, and your absence in a certain institution seems to have not that particular outcome. Therefore, I have to come to the conclusion that you are that meddling mischief monger who's constantly interfering with my practices and with my institutions. Now, frankly, state control and state ownership are two different things, which is why I've been speaking of freedom from state control and not freedom from state ownership. Temples are not the sampatti of the state. Let's be very clear. Okay? Under no circumstances, no temple is being funded by any state government or any central government. And I'm happy to challenge anyone on this because I'm aware of the history of where the money comes from and what is the origin. Whether it is Article 295 or 290A of the Constitution or whatever, I'm aware of its history. There is very little that anybody can say in response to my argument on that particular issue. Not a single temple is a state-funded institution. Period. This is a factual statement. It's not a matter of opinion, and there is no counter. I dare anyone to challenge me on this particular position. You will run for cover if you start on that particular argument because you don't know the history on this particular issue. Okay. So therefore, this is a factual statement. If this is the factual statement, the simple question is, you don't give me money. I don't survive on your, let's say, munificence. Who are you? Why are you here in the first place? Okay. And why do you believe you have the right to dictate and rewrite the identity of my institution and my traditions? We are all constitutional patriots. We worship this book called the Constitution. Now, please tell me, where do you derive your powers under the Constitution to interfere like this? Please answer that particular question. Now, the state can certainly initiate certain activities in the name of reform under Article 25(2)(b). For social welfare and reform, it can do so. You have to distinguish between what the judiciary can do with respect to a religious practice and what a state can do with respect to a religious practice. The state can certainly legislate if it believes that certain practices are either regressive or they affect the reputation of certain groups or certain class sections, let's say cross sections. That is the power that is given. Even there, I would say, it seems like you seem to be reserving the use of this power exclusively with one particular community. Does this mean that you lack the guts to do this with any other community? Please tell us then what is it that we are supposed to do to protect our interest. We will also resort to the same ways and means and the same responses. We are happy to do so. Because if only one particular kind of response ensures that the state remains at bay with respect to your practice, you're pushing that particular part of the society to start thinking on those lines, that unless and until we adopt the same aggressive position or belligerent position, we will constantly be treated like human doormats. That is going to be the response. Now, coming to the judiciary's response, the judiciary has very limited role in the absence of state action. No religious practice, no societal practice can directly be challenged in a court of law in the absence of state action, because the judiciary as an unelected body is only the watchdog of the constitution with respect to encroachment of the constitution by the state. It has no direct role in the society. Okay. If the state interferes with my practice, or if the state chooses to do something with my practice, I have the right to go to the court to say that the state is interfering with my practice, protect my rights. But the judiciary itself cannot suddenly pick up a practice from the society and say, no, let's start doing away with Pashubali. Let's start doing away with Muharram processions. Let's start doing away with this and that. That's not for the judiciary to do. Neither the constitution permits it, nor does the history of the constitution permit it. And I don't think there is any constitution anywhere in the world, at least in a civilized society, where a judiciary, which is practically an unelected body, has this kind of power over the electorate's practices and ways of life. So when you speak of, let's say, impact on traditional practices or let's say ways of life, separate the role played by the state and separate the role played by the judiciary. The specific trigger conditions and boundary conditions in which the state operates and the judiciary operates are very, very different under the constitution. So the judiciary's role is not triggered until there is state action, and the state's role will need to be justified, where the state has to explain what do you believe is a problem with a certain practice before you start wielding the stick called reform. I'm not against the concept of reform. Reform is a perfectly valid justification. But as they say, noble intentions pave the way to hell. Please explain what is your noble intention and what is your justification for it. And I might as well understand if you've made a case for it. Are you able to articulate it? What is the goal? What is the process? I need due process as far as the goal is concerned, and I also need due process as far as the path is concerned. Neither will the end justify the means, nor the means justify the end. Both need to be constitutionally justified in order for you to hold your case in the court. So the burden on the state to interfere is high. And if the state itself has to satisfy this high burden, forget the question of burden, the judiciary can't even do it. It doesn't have the power to do it under the constitution. So every time I make this argument, somebody says, अरे सती का क्या हुआ, विडो रीमैरिज का क्या हुआ? अरे किस कोर्ट ने सती को बैनिश किया? It was through a legislation. Untouchability को किसने बैनिश किया? Article 17 of the Constitution. It's the act of the legislature of the Parliament. Caste related issues पे किसने position लिया? It's the legislature at the end of the day. So which societal practice from history are you going to court where the judiciary has taken a position and can banish it? It can't. It fundamentally can't. If it is meant to be a democracy, therefore there is the role of the elected members. The judiciary, which is not the consequence of election, cannot under any circumstances take up a certain practice and start passing judgments on it. In fact, if the judiciary follows the collegium system where they appoint their own successors, I would say as long as the judiciary continues to appoint its own successors, you certainly don't have the position to take a position on religious practices or any other practices. When you decide to give the members of the elected, let's say, treasury benches as well as the opposition benches some say with respect to your appointment, then we will talk about it. Until then, you're in no position to actually take up these issues at all. This is not a position that is based on some constitutional opinion, so to speak, on what the Constitution must say. My position is based on what the Constitution already says. Okay. So I don't need to necessarily build an or argument. Mine is an is argument. This is the state of play. This is the state of law, period.
Okay, Chirag, I think almost 1 hour has passed. Maybe you can take up questions you already have probably received from students, and we can have the question answer session also.
Sure, sir. So we invited responses from a lot of applicants who had applied to attend the session, and I'm happy to share that we received more than 200 questions, from which we have picked up few questions which would expand the scope of the session today and probably give a greater insight on understanding the Indic perspective. So now, since we've talked a lot about the DT, I would like to ask you a question pertaining to social issues. My first question comes from a law student who asks that given your stand in Sabrimala, you might be perceived to be as being anti-feminist. What do you think is feminism, and can you outline how or what role can women play with regard to the Indic perspective in nation building?
One, since I certainly don't hope to contest elections ever, I am not going to take a position based on populism or popularity. If it is unpopular, so be it. But if I believe in it and I have reasons to hold a certain position, notwithstanding whatever label somebody chipkofies on my forehead, I don't really care. I honestly don't have a problem with what people say on that particular issue, because had that been the case, the guy who's taken a position in Sabrimala is also the guy who's also arguing for legalization of marijuana. I'm doing both. Okay. So honestly, it's a case-based approach. It's an issue-based approach. Fortunately, my thinking and my training allow me to take nuanced position on the basis of a certain issue without necessarily being bogged down by any camps or labels or ideologies. If I believe that for a certain situation, a certain response is warranted, then I will take that position, even if the rest of the world believes that I'm wrong. I honestly don't care about the opposition I get for that particular position. Now, let me answer in a very stereotypical manner. You know what? Women supported my position. And you know what? I represented women in that particular position. So these are facts. Okay. And if your answer is, these are all conditioned women who already have been conditioned by patriarchy. These are educated, independent-minded women who are in public life, who are doctors, who are engineers, who are lawyers. I had not just Hindu lawyers, I had even Christian lawyers standing next to me and supporting me in my position, because they were Kerala Christians who know the practice better than a lot of people in the rest of the country, who understand that this particular position has got nothing to do with misogyny. It's got nothing to do with patriarchy. The temple itself is dedicated to a male deity who has decided to be celibate for the rest of his existence. If that according to you is the definition of patriarchy, then you're questioning somebody's right to be celibate and alone. Then you're infringing that person's right to privacy. And you're therefore saying your right to what you believe is feminism has to trump on that person's privacy, in which case no man can ever be celibate. You're going to impose yourself on every celibate person. That can't be the argument. And I think you demean the very noble intention in feminism when you reduce the serious argument of feminism to this particular level. You have to ask yourself whether a certain position is valid in the context of a given practice and an institution. The question is always decided by the context. Shabd ka arth jo hai, sandarbh behtar samjhata hai. Therefore, please understand the sandarbh. Without the sandarbh, the shabd is effectively in shunya. It can't have a meaning in vacuum. So, I will never reject the validity of feminism. I will never ever reject the concept of fair opportunity and equal opportunity. But I will certainly ask, kindly don't reduce this to a blunt sword, or let's say a blunt sledgehammer, where you decide to destroy every strand of nuance and every strand of diversity in the name of equality. If there are institutions where men are not allowed, and if there are practices where men are necessarily kept out and they're exclusively dedicated to women, and a safe space of sorts, the buzzword is created for women as well as men in limited circumstances, and then there are spaces which are open to everyone, you have to ask yourself, are you in a position to talk about this particular issue through the prism and through the lens of feminism after having understood it? So I believe that anybody who wants to launch into, let's say, this feministic perspective on this particular issue, trust me when I say this, I respect feminism. I don't need to wear this as a badge of honor or constantly say, yes, I respect it, otherwise I will be socially ostracized or isolated. That is not the fear. I have no such fear. I'm merely saying I respect it because I believe that it has its own validity. But it has its validity depending on Desha, Kala, Samaya, which is the place, what is the context, what is the time, what is the institution. If you fail to observe that nuance, you will single-handedly be responsible for a lot of people being put off and turned away from feminism, which I don't think is what you want. At the end of the day, let's assume for a moment that men are part of the problem. Your idea is to educate men that they are not supposed to behave this way. That can't be done by effectively taking away even those institutions which are necessarily dedicated to male spaces for a specific reason, because the deity is a Naishtika Brahmacharya. I've said this ad nauseum, ad infinitum in multiple places. Somehow when this question keeps coming, it only tells me, देखते हैं या नहीं देखते हैं, या देखने के बाद समझ नहीं पाते, ये मुझे समझ में नहीं आ रहा है. लेकिन this is a very clear position. I am not building convoluted logic at all. I am not building a convoluted position at all. I'm merely saying, please understand what is that institution dedicated to, what kind of a person and what kind of a form. That is the limited question. Now coming to the, let's say, I'm assuming it's a sort of a clickbait question. What is your definition of feminism? I've answered that to a significant extent by saying equal opportunity, fair treatment, depending on what is it that you aspire for. I'll give you an example from a US judgment. A position of a jailer was effectively, and their question was, who do we, let's say, invite as candidates for that particular position? And they necessarily give a height requirement which has got nothing to do with the duty that is to be performed. Therefore, that height requirement is questioned in a constitutional challenge to say, this particular requirement has been designed to keep women out of this particular position without any rhyme or justification or reason. Therefore, there is no nexus between the role or the function that is to be discharged and the requirements that have been spelled out as part of the candidature. And therefore, it's a clear proof of arbitrariness, and therefore, it's a clear proof of discrimination. So if there is no rhyme or reason, but the only apparent reason is to keep someone out, then you arrive at this conclusion of discrimination, because it is rife with arbitrariness. In most instances, arbitrariness and discrimination go hand in hand. But when there is a clear purpose, and that purpose is not to say औरत हो तो बाहर रहो, no, इनका रोल अलग है, इनका जो फॉर्म है ये अलग है, इनका रूप जो अलग है, therefore respect that particular thing, then it is not based on arbitrariness and certainly cannot lead to the conclusion of discrimination. That is the test. So I would say respect feminism, fight for feminism, certainly ensure that spaces which are rife and which smell and reek and smack of patriarchy, go after them, no problems. But please do observe that just as you expect safe spaces for women, the other gender too may have rights and expectations of safe spaces in certain instances, and this is a religious institution. So kindly consider that. If there are institutions where men have to necessarily be evicted from the streets altogether in the very same state, in the same region, with respect to a deity who is female in nature, and this is also a state where menstruation is even, let's say, worshipped in multiple institutions and multiple places of worship, perhaps we have mistaken 1D for another, the 1D being diversity, the other being discrimination. You have conflated both, and you're unable to strike a distinction between diversity and discrimination. Perhaps if you apply your sense of discrimination, you will not arrive at the conclusion that it is a discrimination.
Thank you, sir, for this answer. The next question asks that what is your stand with regard to the caste and reservation system in India? And when do you think that India as a country will be ready to abolish this system as per your ideas and analysis?
Okay, good. I think it's a lot of baits that I'm walking into, so I might as well walk into it, no problem. See, let me bluntly state my position, citing 3 specific developments in modern Indian history post-independence and even before independence. Read literature on decoloniality, especially books authored by this Argentinian scholar, Walter de Mignolo. Fantastic book on theory and practical applications of decoloniality. And he is established through examples that every colonized society has seen its society being portrayed in the worst of lights possible through the intellectuals who walked along with that particular colonizer to effectively create justifications for staying in that particular place, for colonizing that particular place, for destroying your places of worship, for destroying your ways of life, and to effectively portray you as demons, savages, barbarians, and whatnot. Now, if this is something that has happened in the entire world and the rest of the world, to then make the statement that India is somehow a curious exception to this particular treatment is ahistoric and is completely illogical. if the same colonizer has had a kind of approach to other indigenous societies, what is your logic to say that he has not done the same thing with my society? Where is this going to? I am making the very clear statement that what you understand of the caste system is largely based on British sources, period. You cite sources which you're going to cite against me, and if you land on Manusmriti, I will push you immediately to ask you, do you understand the language? Do you understand which is the time period to which Manusmriti is supposed to be applied? Whoever told you that Manusmriti is applicable to the current situation or to the current place and time, what is the source that you have actually read? Therefore, immediately the question is going to be, if this is a 5,000 year society at the very least, and that's a very conservative estimate, assuming that it's a 5,000 year society, and you fundamentally believe that a society evolves and moves and is a fluid creature, is it your case that the concept of caste, the notion of caste has been static for 5,000 years in India? If the answer is a no, how did you arrive at this atrocity literature without actually asking yourself, from which period are you sourcing this particular literature? What can you attribute these behaviors to? Let me also say this. I'm not going to be an apologist for untouchability. I'm not necessarily going to deny the existence of caste-based discrimination. But you see, it happens across the chain. Everybody does it to everybody else. Okay? It's not a one-way street, by the way. Okay? So when you want to talk of caste discrimination, it's not a one-way street. At the same time, I recently had the opportunity to take part in another debate on caste, constitution, and religion. I think there are three baskets in which Indian history will have to be analyzed for you to understand what is this creature of caste. One, you can't use the word caste itself because it is substitutably used for both jati and varna and kula, and caste does not do justice to all three terms. I have learned in the recent past, thanks to my exposure to better informed people, that jati is a birth-based association, kula is a cultural affiliation, varna is based on guna, which is to effectively say what is the characteristic displayed by a certain group, which is to say rajogun, tamogun, or sattvigun. That's effectively how it has been described. Okay, and therefore, who you consider as kshatriyas in a certain point of time have not been kshatriyas in another phase of history, and who you consider shudras at one particular point of time have not been shudras before or thereafter. So what has happened is, think of the Varna Vyavastha, all the four baskets of the caste system, as four different spaces, with people changing their positions in the four spaces in different periods. In fact, there is a word in English which translates to the word outcast, paraya. Have you heard of it? I'm sure everybody's heard of it. That comes from a community in Tamil Nadu called Parayar. That is how the British man learned this word. Okay. Because at one point of time, they were treated as untouchables. Okay. Now, when the British entered this particular country, they obviously had the status of untouchables. They were being subjected to a lot of degradation, a lot of inferior treatment. There is no running away from it. But if you read their own history, you will realize at some stage they were treated at par with Brahmins, by the way. And they were treated as Brahmins also. Okay. Their own songs and their own native literature, their own indigenous literature, records this as part of their popular folk songs. They identify the individual as well. And my source in this particular regard is a fantastic gentleman whose knowledge of Southern Indian history, especially caste relations, is encyclopedic, Aravindan Neelakantam, who's one of the co-authors of the book called Breaking India along with Rajiv Malhotra. Okay, you should read that particular book, and you should also read his works. He's amazing. So here's the situation, that when the British man comes, he assumes that what he sees and what is visible to his eye is the whole and soul of the caste system. And he's been unable to distinguish between caste, kula, that is Varna, Jati, and Kula. And he decides to classify this particular society as a society based on these four characteristics. And he believes that the very same group has been Brahmins for the rest of the history. The very same group has been Kshatriya for the rest of history. The very same group has been Vaishya or Shudra for the rest of the society. Not true. I don't know how many Punjabis are there as part of this particular participant group, but there is a surname called Dutt, Dutt. Okay. And Dutt, effectively, they come from the Muhyal community. Okay. And the Muhyals are traditionally Brahmins or priests who gave up the priestly profession to pick up the sword and land owning. Okay. And at one stage, they effectively became a community which started sending all their firstborns into the army. They decided to take pride in actually creating a martial tradition. You'll find a similar equivalent in Bihar. So the Bhumihars are known as Bhumihar Brahmins by some, and some believe that they're not Brahmins. In whatever situation it may be, who is their preceptor and who is their preceptor deity. They believe in Parshuramji, and that's how they effectively trace their origins. And if you look at their history, it's not exactly something set in stone. It has been slightly fluid. Whether they're landowning, whether they're a martial community, whether they're a priestly community, has depended on which phase of the society or which phase of history you're actually looking at. I'm never ever going to say that the system is completely flawless. I'm not glorifying it to the extent of saying, no, this is absolutely perfect, let's bring it back. I'm not even going to make that argument. I'm simply saying, please understand that there is a significant amount of mischief that this aspect of history has been subjected to by someone who has a vested interest in converting you, let me use that blunt word, and then also in justifying his, let's say, his endeavor to civilize you. He effectively called this a civilizing move. He justified his colonization as a civilizing imperative because you're the barbarian, you're the savage. Okay. So when you look at caste-related issues, here's a contemporary question. When any of you or any of us who's a practicing Hindu visits a temple, who asks you your caste, by the way? Nobody does, right? When you decide to buy a book of the Veda, is the seller of the book asking you your caste? 250 रुपए में 4 वेद जो है ऑनलाइन मिल रहे हैं. कौन आपको रोक रहा है भाई? Who is stopping you? Who is asking you your caste before doing any of this? So justifications which are perhaps relevant in terms of saying this happened, when you decide to appropriate it to the present, ask yourself that there are multiple realities in India. Urban India is different, rural India is different. Even in rural India, the relations are very different. You assume that they're constantly living in a state of discrimination. You ask them, it's very different. In urban India, nobody dares to ask the other person's caste identity. It has become completely politically incorrect to ask that question. But in rural India, you can continue to ask that question. Nobody is going to mind that, by the way. Because there's a clear difference in ideology, there's a clear difference in worldview, there's a clear difference in what you think is acceptable and what is not. Who are they to say you're wrong and who are you to say they're wrong? Both of us, I think, live in completely different universes. So it's not possible for us to judge one by the other. Let me clarify so that I'm not seen as whitewashing anything that is wrong. This is very important because I've seen that a lot of people latch onto one statement and they say he's creating an apology for something. I'm making the clear statement that whether that particular institution was completely legitimate, was completely scripture sanctioned, was completely perfect, is not something that can be debated in the absence of literature. And unless and until you have enough literature, you have studied something, it's a complex subject for you to comment on. Let us be humble on that particular aspect. Second, since it's a long history, don't use one phase of history to tar the entire history. That's not the example. If that had been the case, how is it that every community that has built the temple is not necessarily a Brahminical community? The Vishwakarma community is not a Brahmin community. The Vishwakarma community continues to wear the Janevu. You go to any Sthapati family, a sculptor family, he is the one who actually puts the Veda in action when he decides to chisel the Veda in the form of a Dravidian temple or a Dravidian architecture temple or even a Nagara temple for that matter. So what we assume, what we have done is that we have imbibed all the salient features of the critical race theory and imposed it on the caste system. And we have transposed the African-American experience on the Indian system, saying this is exactly what has happened. At the very least, we have not even been able to understand that there is a clear racial element there. You've still not been able to establish that there is a racial element here because your Aryan invasion theory is not able to hold itself up yet. You've not been able to establish it yet, okay? So considering all of this, it's too complex a subject for us to actually say, I know what is 100% true with the kind of arrogant certitude that comes with saying I'm an anti-caste person. If nobody has been able to destroy that particular system, despite all these so-called caste revolutions happening, despite Ambedkar, despite affirmative action, you have only entrenched caste further because you have effectively hinged caste entitlements on the basis of birth-based caste identity. So if you really want to address that, then you should unshackle it from the issue of birth-based caste identity for the purposes of caste reservations. You will never have the guts to do it. You will never have the honesty to do it because it's a hornet's nest and you don't want to stir that nest. So as long as you don't have the interest in abolishing a particular structure, you're in no position to talk about abolition of caste as an identity. That said, I do believe that reservation on the basis of caste may be relevant for the foreseeable future, provided you realize that that doesn't become another form of reservation like an unreserved compartment, that one who gets reservation doesn't allow others to get reservation. Because if people and their socio-economic positions have changed with time, then different communities are entitled to reservation at different points in time. That must be the basic realization at the very least. If you say, "Main aa gaya, yahan pe baith gaya, aur yahan pe ad gaya," sorry, that's not how it may work. Okay, we may have to strike a balance. In fact, again, Aravinda Neelakantan cited, in fact, I'm supposed to have a longish podcast with him on this particular issue where he will tell you, and I want people to listen to him. He's one of the finest human beings that I've met and one of the finest scholars that I've met on this particular subject, where he establishes that the affirmative system of the reservation that we have today is a continuum of proportional representation that the Hindu society has always had for those communities which have not had a say in societal decision making, where there has been a mechanism that has been worked out even in the past to ensure that they have a say in state employment, in state representation, in public policy and decision making, so on and so forth. So I would still justify the reservation system on the basis of some kind of representation in public life, because a community at the end of the day craves what? Visibility. I need to be seen and heard so that people acknowledge my presence. That is what it ultimately does. Okay. So you're catering to that fundamental human aspiration, and I don't see anything wrong with it.
So thank you, Saif, for that answer. Now moving from, say, issues of caste to education, I wanted to know what is your view on the Gurukul method of education and how can we revive the system, given it is somewhat in line with your Indic perspective.
So I think it was Sri Dharampal who wrote in his book about the at least close to 6.5 lakh Gurukuls that were still prevalent around the time that the British had entered this country. So the maximum amount of deracination, the maximum amount of erosion of traditional institutions you have seen not during the period before the British, by the way, because you see, here's what happens. Someone comes and decides to slap you, you decide to slap him back. That's the human reaction. Unless you're, of course, Gandhi, who claims to show the other cheek. I don't believe in him or his ideology. I have no faith in it. I'm entitled to disagree with him. That is my view. So I certainly believe when somebody decides to unsheath the sword and destroy your places of worship or your, let's say, your institutions, at some stage you're bound to respond to it. At some stage you're bound to continue resisting it. And therefore, overt aggression always, and in most cases, is bound to elicit an overt response. And as long as there is an overt response and overt resistance, your way of life will continue. Despite a form of aggression that the Indian subcontinent was witness to for close to 1100 years or even 1200 years, its institutions continued to survive because of active resistance from multiple parts of the country. But when someone decides to come and co-opt you and say, no, some of you are part of me and others are inferior. Okay. So when that happens, and gradually he educates you into a certain system where your sense of prestige, social standing is derived by attaching yourself to that particular system, gradually your form of education is bound to be pushed to the quarters and pushed to the margins. Let us be very, very honest. Among the first few communities to immediately or at least take up service under the British were the Brahmins and the non-Brahmin upper castes. That is what history says. As a consequence of which, English education became a source of, let's say, revenue, prestige, and social standing. Okay. And when that happens, those who have been traditionally responsible for protecting your way of life or for furthering your way of life by adopting the role of a bhikshuk or the role of a shikshak, and if they have given up that particular role, where will the Gurukula stand and how will it survive? So I don't think you can actually blame the outsider entirely, because he was doing what he believed was good for his interest. And you decide to sacrifice your community's interest, so to speak, at the altar of your personal interest. And today you're saying there's no Gurukula, then sit and blame your ancestor. What is the point in blaming the white man? It makes very little sense. Okay. If you really want to blame him entirely, you can blame the thief for entering the house which is open, but to leave it unlocked and to invite the thief is your problem. And you did that. And not just that, you actively collaborated with the thief as well. So you participated in the loot of your own house by taking employment with the invader, so to speak, or the colonizer, so to speak. So you are in very little, I mean, you don't have the moral authority to cry victim anymore. If you want to do that, and if you want the rest of the society to adopt a Gurukula system, then are you willing to effectively live the rigorous life that you were expected to live, which effectively meant that your life will be spent in the pursuit of knowledge and not in the pursuit of money. Can you do that? Are you capable of choosing Lakshmi or let's say Saraswati over Lakshmi? If not, why are you pointing fingers at the rest of the society? You have to realize that most societies, there is a core that does the function of protecting that society's way of life. When that core effectively buckles, there is a domino effect that follows in most instances. And what has happened is that the core of this particular society buckled, and not just buckled, but also converted into the other man's way of life. And the moment this has happened, I think everything else that has happened is a logical consequence and a sequitur of that. The fact that our society still continues to retain its traditions, the credit must go to the Hindu masses for keeping those traditions alive, for keeping those places of worship alive, for ensuring that there are still multitudes who throng these places to keep the traditions alive. Not the elitists, not the ones who believe that no, we effectively derive our sense of, because you see, the first thing that you have to realize that a way of life is an idea first and then a reality next. So if West has become a way of life in your headspace first, regardless of whichever jurisdiction you live in, whichever territory you live in, you will try to recreate the West here. And therefore, you'll always have a sense of resistance to your way of life. That's how it works. I don't think it's rocket science in that particular sense.
Sure, sir. And any particular way do you think that we can revive the Gurukul system of education?
The NEP was, I think, a good opportunity, and perhaps it's an incremental step forward. But there is something that I think the NEP lacks. I'm not an educationist, nor am I an educator. So I should be very, very careful in what I say. Let me limit myself to the portions on legal education when it comes to the NEP, which I'm in position to speak of with some degree of confidence and expertise. As long as Indic jurisprudence is relegated to the margins when it comes to legal philosophy, when it comes to commercial application, when it comes to transactional relevance and contemporary purchase, it will continue to fester in your mind that the concept of rule of law and the concept of justice is a foreign import, is an Anglo-Saxon import. And as long as that happens, you will always belabor under the delusion that the concept of private property itself is a foreign import, and nothing can be further from the truth. Okay? So there, I believe that the NEP perhaps hasn't done enough with respect to legal education. I'm not in a position to speak on what it has done to other aspects of education, but legal education is very, very critical because policies come from legal minds, and at least they contribute to legal policies at some stage. And if your reference point and your yardstick and your benchmark is going to be a Eurocentric approach, then no matter what you have done with respect to other aspects of education, when it comes to application and policy, it will continue to be the same Eurocentric mind that works. Okay. So perhaps NEP could have done more. In fact, we sent a representation. I was asked to give my inputs. There was only one paragraph in the draft NEP, paragraph 16.7, where it limited itself to legal education. And the only thing that it spoke of is legal education must now be equipped to meet the challenges of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Arey Baba, is that the issue? First you think of originality, then you think of everything else. Okay. What is the point of trying to catch up with the rest of the world when you have really nothing original to offer? So what will you do? Because you're a copycat, what the West does with respect to AI, you'll do with AI. इसमें क्या सोचना है? यही तो करोगे तुम. चेपना ही तो आता है और क्या आता है? Okay. So the point is, the purpose of the NEP should be to drill a sense of originality. I'm not sure it has done it in its entirety. I'm not saying it has not. I'm simply saying, as far as my area is concerned, these are my comments.
Sure, sir. So now moving on to issues of national importance. So your stance on the Uniform Civil Code is quite unique, wherein you are more in favor of the Citizenship Amendment Act, but not in favor of the Uniform Civil Code. So can you please state why you are against UCC, and is there a way that we can ensure UCC in some form that it is acceptable to everyone, especially the majority community in India?
So first point is, my position on CA is what it is because I believe in that particular issue. And even if this particular government or any other government had come out with it, I'd have still supported it. So it is an issue-based approach. Merely because the sroth, or let's say the source of the two policies are the same entity, I'm under no obligation to agree with that particular policy. Okay. I believe in a national NRC in principle. I've debated it in public. I've thrashed it out in public, and I've given my positions as to why I believe that is the case. Notwithstanding the Assam example, I believe in CA because if I believe that Bharat is a civilizational state, it owes a civilizational and, dare I say, constitutional responsibility to adherence of its civilizational faiths. 3, on the aspect of UCC, there is a decent chance that some may have misunderstood my position. And because I've been reading a few opinions put out in public domain on this particular aspect, maybe because you're expected to operate in binaries, a position which is in gray is uncomfortable to most people. So let me be clear on what my position is. 1, I could see what the CAA was because of the policy of the government with respect to long-term visas, which it had initiated in 2016. So I could understand what the CAA could be. Now, here's my question to anybody who wants to say that UCC must be supported under any circumstances. Have you seen the document in its draft form at least? Do you know what you're batting for at least? You know in principle that there is something called as a uniform civil code which seeks to harmonize and bring uniformity in civil laws. Fine. Which aspects of civil law, to what degree is the harmonization, and to what extent will it affect the rights of each community with respect to its personal laws is something that is unclear. So which is why I said, neither am I for it nor am I against it, but I will take a position only after I have some clarity on what the particular document is all about. And the other position that I've also taken is perhaps a uniform civil code is better implemented in an optional form, which is to basically say, assume that I believe in tradition and somebody believes in the secular form of marriage, okay? Then the secular guy must have the option of abiding by the UCC, and I must have the option of living by my tradition, okay? And therefore, an optional UCC is perhaps going to be better accepted and will meet with lesser resistance from across the board. And this may be something that could be at least explored in principle. Am I the first person to make this statement? I am not. The precursor to the Bharatiya Janata Party, namely the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, its founder and one of the leading luminaries of Indian history, Shri Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, took this exact position when the Hindu Code Bill was introduced against the wishes of the majority by Shri Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who effectively claims to be the fount of all that is secular and rational in this country. Okay. So the founder of the predecessor of the Bharatiya Janata Party took a position with respect to the unilateral imposition and let's say enforcement of the Hindu Code Bill without discussion with stakeholders, without consultation with stakeholders. I am therefore saying I am being consistent and true to the founder of your predecessor. Okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2. I don't care about how many wives does member of any other community get to marry. That's not my problem. I'm basically asking, what are you going to do with respect to my laws and my traditions? That's my primary concern. Okay. Now, I'm in response to this, I'm basically told, therefore, are you saying that all Hindus must not have the same law? Of course, I'm saying that. I mean, if you can't understand this, then what more can I say? Why? Because different parts of the country, Hindus have different personal laws. They have different forms of marriages. They have different traditions. Therefore, when Hinduism itself is not in the mold of an Abrahamic monolith, to say that the same form of code must apply to Hindus itself is something that I will be defeating the rights of various communities under Articles 25 and 26 and 29. They have cultural rights, they have linguistic rights, they have script-related rights, they have way of life rights, they have religious rights, they have denominational rights. You need to make a case much better than simply saying unify, unify, unify. And you have to explain what is the problem that you wish to address. Now, if the question is of monogamy, the question is of adultery, the question is of maintenance, fine. I understand that there is some common ground and maybe there can be discussion on that. But I still haven't seen a document. Show me a model legislation which will effectively be discussed as a uniform civil code, which anybody has prepared in the last 73 years, despite Article 44 being in the Constitution for the last 73 years. What have you presented? If it's only still in works, it seems like it's a pipe dream. You really want to move ahead, it is for you to take the initiative and show what is it that you have in the alternative. So for instance, since I am interested in freeing temples from the state, some people, and legitimately so, are saying, if the government moves out, what's your alternative? from temples? Who will control and manage these temples? Therefore, show some alternative. You know what? While I don't need to show an alternative to show why the government's presence is constitutional, I will still show an alternative so that we have some sense of continuity. The same logic I will apply to the Uniform Civil Code to basically say, it is for you to show what is the document on which you want my endorsement and acceptance. Tell me what am I expected to sign off on. बिना पढ़े मैं थोड़ी साइन कर लूंगा भाई. ये बाजीगर थोड़ी है कि उसने सफेद कागज पे कोरे कागज पे साइन करा दिया. ऐसे थोड़ी हो सकता है. That can't be the way this works, right? You have to show me what is it that I'm expected to cede. What is the extent of concessions that are expected from me. Until then, I'm not saying I'm against you. I'm simply saying I am against a blind endorsement of a policy whose flesh and blood character I have not seen. I started supporting the CAA even before it in principle, but once the CAA came about, I basically said this document meets my requirements and it will pass constitutional muster, therefore I support. So अगर मैंने CAA को पूरी तरह से support करना शुरू किया only after the document has come about, why are you asking me to support the UCC in principle without seeing what the document says? Therefore, if my allegiance is not to an institution or an organization, but to an issue, it is not proof of inconsistency. It is proof of issue-based consistency. As simple as that.
So thank you, Sai, for your insights. Just wanted to ask, why do you think that the Constitution is a dharmic document at heart? Because you've stated this, I think, earlier. So we just wanted to know, why do you think Constitution is a dharmic document?
The first clarification that I think becomes very, very important is dharma is not equal to religion. Dharma is not religion. I repeat, dharma is not religion. Okay. We have used Hindu dharma merely to distinguish it from other Abrahamic faiths. But dharma, as understood in our philosophy, is not religion. It translates roughly to a code of righteous and moral conduct. Okay. And something that is unique and indigenous to this particular country. Okay. So this statement was made in the context of what is Bharat's constitutional morality. And I wrote a certain piece in the first post on this particular subject. And there I cited, and at least I was drawing from Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishna's position, that whatever may be the diversity of this particular country, the one thing that it is unified by is its adherence to the concept of dharma. Therefore, whenever you speak of constitutional morality or public morality, what you will be guided by is the concept of dharma. Therefore, when you speak of public morality under Article 25 or you speak of public morality under Article 26, what you're guided by is notion of a certain degree of balance between individual rights and societal, let's say, expectation, or individual rights and individual duty. That is what dharma effectively translates to. The problem is the modern day discourse effectively says dharma is effectively religion, and this nonsense is, continues to be spewed by pop culture and movies where they don't understand Aaj Dharm ko Nyay Nichit Kar Diya and all that we saw in that movie called Mulk, and they don't even know what they're talking about. Therefore, you have conflated dharma with mazhab. It is not. Okay? An Abrahamic notion or a European notion of religion is religio is equal to faith. Okay? That is what is the root word, that is the etymology, that is the Latin etymology. We don't believe in that. We fundamentally believe that a certain path leads to liberation. We understand that there is a distinction between liberation and salvation. So if the ultimate goal between two different faith systems is very different, where you believe in salvation and I don't believe in salvation, I believe in liberation and you don't believe in liberation, how can you equate my approach to the particular path of the particular goal? The end destination is not the same. How can the path be the same? Impossible. Your concept of heaven, my concept of Swarga, your concept of hell and my concept of Narakloka is all very different. They are not the same. You are trying to approximate the two so that you are in a position to understand. But that's not the same as saying that they are identical. They are no way identical. So considering that, let us realize that when we speak of it as a dharmic document, or when we say that India is the land of dharma, you recognize two things. One, dharma is not religion. Second, dharma as a concept is native to this particular land. It has originated in this particular land. The relationship between ideas, ways of life and territory is something that is civilizationally recognized across civilizations. So when I say that it is dharma that shall define this particular land, that has been the grunt norm, the compass on the basis of which this civilization has operated for millennia. And therefore, there is nothing that anybody can do about it. The constitution recognizes it, but whether the constitution recognizes it or not, at the end of the day, civilization and history move at a certain pace and nobody can stop that.
Thank you, Sai. One final question for today's session, and I would like to come full circle and would want to ask you that to know one's history and identity is vital for growth and development. True, but what next? So where does the road of Indic perspective actually lead to?
The road of Indic perspective leads to three tangible and intangible outcomes. One is civilizational awareness and civilizational consciousness, which is at the meta level. That is the first. Without that, nothing happens. The second is what does it translate to intangible reclamation of identity, which means at the political level, at the societal level, at the legal level. Three is when civilizational awareness effectively plays a significant role. I'm not saying a complete role, a significant role in policy initiatives. See, let's be very clear. The Upanishadic way is to say that wherever good ideas come from, you please be open to them and receptive to them. So I'm not asking people to shut their eyes and ears to all ideas that come from the rest of the world. Impossible. Obviously, India has learned a lot from other countries and other civilizations as well. You can't say that India has existed as an island, as a cocoon. Impossible. It has traded with so many people. It has done business with so many people. When the concept of trade and business was something that was not even recorded. We have been doing it for millennia now. With even Roman societies, we have been doing in 300 BC, 400 BC, whatnot. Okay. In fact, Roman coins, you'll find it even in temples of Kerala. Okay, you will find them in temples of Kerala. So considering that, it is impossible to say we traded with them, but we never learned anything from them. Not possible. Okay. However, perhaps what I'm doing is similar to what there is a very famous figure in Jewish history. Maimonides is a very famous philosopher in Jewish history. And when Jews were reeling under the impact of Hellenistic regimes and Hellenistic thought in Babylon and other places, he was telling them, sure, learn from them, but please don't start spitting on your own history. Okay. To respect someone else is not to spit on your home. I don't think that's how it is supposed to work. So Indic perspective is to basically say, learn from everybody else, but be proud of your society as well. And no society is perfect enough to say that it can take pride in every aspect of its history and every part of its history. Okay. And that's no reason to judge this civilization's entire history. Impossible. I don't think that's how it is supposed to work. When you do that, you effectively say that my ancestors were stupid, superstitious, barbaric, and fundamentally casteist and whatnot. I'm not that. Are you so sure that the next generation will be so kind to you? How do you know? They can equally call you idiots, right? So you might as well be a bit more humble and a bit more realistic in your assessment of the past. Just as you think that the past should not be glorified beyond acceptable limits, the past cannot also be vilified beyond acceptable limits. Both are equally bad.
So really thank you, Sai, for this engaging session. In the interest of time, we would like to come to the end of this session. Very few people take a firm stand for their beliefs as Advocate J. Sai Deepak does. And we are really thankful for his presence during the session. We try to touch diverse topics, but the curiosity of the audience would never be satisfied. And that curiosity would help us really to understand the Indic perspective that Sai has shown some light on during the